Carl Jung spent much of his life listening to what most people never dared to say out loud. He sat in silence while patients revealed the hidden corners of their minds, those shadowed places where fear, envy, hatred, and longing twisted together. He came to believe that what was truly dangerous in a person was not simply the mistakes they made or the anger they carried, but something far more subtle, the refusal to recognize what lives inside themselves. For Jung, the most dangerous sign in a person was when they became blind to their own darkness. Jung called this darkness the shadow, not because it was evil by nature, but because it was hidden. Every human being carries it. It is composed of the impulses we deny, the emotions we repress, and the truths we fear to admit even to ourselves. Left unacknowledged, this shadow grows restless. It leaks into our lives through cruelty disguised as justice, jealousy disguised as moral outrage, or hatred disguised as virtue. Jung saw it in the world around him, in the wars and political movements of the 20th century, but also in the everyday cruelty between neighbors, lovers, and families. The person who insists that they have no shadow, who clings desperately to the mask of goodness or superiority, this is where danger begins. For such a person believes they are pure, that their intentions are beyond reproach. And yet, their unexamined shadow does not vanish. It moves beneath the surface, waiting for an opportunity to seize control. Jung observed that entire societies could fall under the spell of such blindness, when leaders projected their own hidden rage onto enemies, or when ordinary citizens turned against scapegoats rather than confronting their own complicity. To stay alert, Jung suggested, we must learn to see the signs of this blindness. A dangerous person is often one who cannot admit fault, who reacts with hostility when confronted, who must always believe that the evil lies somewhere else, in another person, another group, another nation. This inability to look inward is what transforms ordinary flaws into something destructive. For Jung, the problem was not that people had darkness, but that they refused to meet it face to face. Jung himself was not immune. He confessed that his own dreams revealed cruel and violent impulses, and he insisted that to pretend otherwise would be a lie. He believed that honesty about the shadow was not a weakness but a strength, a form of humility that kept the destructive side of the psyche in check. In his writings, he often described the figures of mythology and religion, tricksters, demons, tempters, not as alien beings, but as symbols of the very forces that stir within each of us. The dangerous sign, then, was not the presence of such forces, but the denial of them. When someone speaks with too much certainty about their own virtue, when they declare themselves free of envy, anger, or desire, Jung would remind us to listen carefully. What they have buried does not simply disappear. It waits, it festers, and in moments of crisis it can erupt with shocking violence. To Jung, the person who claims to be without a shadow is like a house with locked rooms, silent, dark, and filled with things the owner refuses to touch. It is not the house itself that is dangerous, but what may break loose when the doors can no longer hold. Jung often warned that the greatest danger does not come from an enemy outside us, but from what lies unacknowledged within. He had seen too many men and women who tried to run from their own inner life, who built a mask so convincing that they themselves began to believe in it. This mask, which Jung called the persona, was useful in society. It allowed people to play roles, to meet expectations, to function within families and workplaces. But when the mask grew too rigid, when a person became identified with it completely, it hid the shadow so deeply that they forgot it was even there. This forgetting was not harmless. A man who imagines himself incapable of cruelty may unconsciously act it out in subtle ways, disguised as righteousness or as discipline. A woman who insists she feels no envy may quietly poison her own relationships, unable to bear the sight of someone else thriving. The mask becomes a shield, and the more tightly someone clings to it, the more their hidden impulses grow restless in the dark. For Jung, this restlessness could eventually erupt in ways that shocked both the person and everyone around them. He observed this dynamic not only in individuals but in entire cultures. The German people of his own time, for instance, were educated, disciplined, and proud of their achievements. Yet beneath the surface of this cultural persona lay unresolved fears, resentments, and collective shadows. When these forces were denied, they were projected outward. What could not be admitted within was instead blamed on scapegoats. Jung understood this as a dangerous sign, one that revealed how denial of the shadow can spread from a single person to an entire nation, until destruction follows on a massive scale. In the life of an individual, the process works the same way, only on a smaller stage. Jung wrote that what a person refuses to face within themselves will be forced upon them from the outside, as if fate itself conspires to make them see what they ignore. The unacknowledged shadow returns in the form of endless conflict, broken friendships, or failures that repeat without explanation. Someone who swears they are not angry may find themselves surrounded by hostile people. Someone who denies their own capacity for betrayal may become the victim of it again and again. What is not brought to light from within comes to meet us from without. The dangerous sign, then, is not loud or obvious at first. It is subtle, quiet, a kind of rigidity in the way a person presents themselves. They become too certain of their own goodness, too defensive when confronted, too unwilling to consider that their flaws may live in the very places they deny. This defensiveness is not strength but fragility, a brittle wall that must be protected at all costs. Jung believed that when this wall finally cracks, what pours through can be devastating, because it has been gathering force for years in silence. For Jung, the path of wisdom was not to destroy the shadow but to learn to live with it. To say, yes, I carry anger, envy, pride, cruelty, but I will not let these things rule me. The shadow is part of what makes us human. To imagine that we can be entirely rid of it is an illusion, and it is that illusion which makes a person truly dangerous. What cannot be admitted cannot be managed. What cannot be managed eventually bursts free. And when it does, it can sweep away not only the person themselves but those who stand near them. Jung often turned to myths and ancient stories to explain why the shadow must be faced. He believed that our ancestors told these tales not only to entertain but to remind us of truths that never change. In many legends, the hero does not find strength by avoiding the monster, but by confronting it directly. The monster is terrifying because it mirrors what lives inside the hero himself. To run from it is to remain weak. To face it is to discover hidden power. Jung saw this pattern not as fantasy but as a psychological law. What we fear most in ourselves is also where our greatest potential lies. He wrote that the shadow contains not only destructive impulses but also vitality, creativity, and energy that have been suppressed. A person who denies their aggression may also cut themselves off from courage. Someone who hides their selfishness may also lose the ability to pursue their own dreams. In trying to appear pure, they become shallow, brittle, and disconnected from life. Jung warned that this hollowness is another dangerous sign, for it shows that the person has sacrificed authenticity for the safety of the mask. What is left behind is not wholeness but emptiness. In his work with patients, Jung often saw how transformative it could be when someone finally admitted their shadow. A man who had lived his whole life denying his anger would break down and confess it, and in doing so he became less cruel, not more. A woman who admitted her envy found herself more capable of kindness, not less. By allowing the shadow into awareness, they robbed it of its hidden power. It no longer needed to erupt unconsciously, because it had been given a voice in the light of day. This, Jung believed, was the path to maturity. The danger was not in having a shadow, but in being possessed by it without knowing. Jung compared this to being overtaken by an unseen force. People who insist they are incapable of darkness are the ones most likely to act it out unconsciously. They may suddenly turn vindictive, destructive, or violent, and afterward they will swear that it was not truly them, that it came from nowhere. But in truth it came from the locked rooms of their own psyche, rooms they refused to open. The eruption feels alien because they never claimed those parts as their own. For Jung, the individual who could acknowledge their flaws, their envy, their selfishness, their aggression, was far less dangerous than the one who denied all of it. The honest man who admits his shadow can work with it, guide it, and keep it in check. But the man who swears he has no darkness at all is like a blind driver racing down a crowded street. He believes he sees clearly, but in reality he has no idea what forces steer his hand. It is not his virtue that makes him safe, but his blindness that makes him perilous. Jung warned that modern society made this blindness worse. He saw how industrial culture demanded people present themselves as efficient, polite, and rational, leaving no space for raw emotions. This constant performance pushed the shadow deeper underground. People became so concerned with how they appeared that they forgot who they were. And when the mask was finally stripped away, what emerged was often shocking, because it carried the weight of years of repression. Jung believed that one of the clearest signs of danger in a person was projection. Projection happens when someone takes the qualities they cannot admit in themselves and sees them only in others. A man who denies his own dishonesty will become obsessed with finding liars everywhere he looks. A woman who hides her own aggression may call everyone else violent and cruel. In doing this, the person protects their fragile mask, but at the cost of warping the way they see the world. Jung warned that projection makes a person blind not only to themselves but to reality itself. This blindness is not harmless. When an individual cannot admit to their own envy or cruelty, they place it on others and begin to treat them as enemies. Families break apart because one member cannot see that the faults they accuse others of are their own. Nations fall into conflict because leaders project their hidden rage onto outsiders. Jung saw this during the rise of fascism, where collective shadows were projected onto minorities, creating a cycle of fear and destruction. What was denied within was hunted without, and the result was catastrophe. In everyday life, projection reveals itself in smaller but still destructive ways. The friend who accuses everyone else of betrayal may be hiding their own unfaithfulness. The colleague who cannot stop calling others lazy may secretly fear their own lack of discipline. These patterns are so common that they often go unnoticed, but Jung considered them one of the most important signals of the shadow at work. A person who projects constantly, who cannot reflect on their own part in conflict, who always believes the darkness lies elsewhere, carries within them the most dangerous sign of all. Jung insisted that facing the shadow requires humility. It means pausing before condemning another, and asking if the same flaw might live in oneself. This act of reflection is not comfortable. It demands honesty that can feel unbearable at first. Yet without it, a person becomes increasingly dangerous, because they live in a world distorted by their own denials. Every enemy they see is partly themselves. Every flaw they condemn is a reflection of what they refuse to acknowledge. In this way, the unexamined shadow not only destroys relationships but also corrodes the mind from within. For Jung, the most dangerous sign was not rage itself, or envy, or cruelty. It was certainty without reflection, the inability to doubt one's own innocence. This kind of person becomes a prisoner of their own mask, unable to see the human complexity in themselves or in others. And when life inevitably forces the shadow to the surface, when events strip away the carefully built facade, what emerges is raw and untamed. Jung believed that tragedies often begin with people who could not bear to look in the mirror and see their whole self. He reminded us that light cannot exist without darkness, and the psyche cannot be whole without the shadow. To deny this truth is to build a fragile tower that cannot stand. When such a tower collapses, it falls not only on the one who built it but on everyone nearby. That is why Jung urged constant vigilance, not against others alone, but against the signs of blindness within ourselves. For the person who refuses this inner work does not only carry danger for themselves, but becomes a danger to all around them. Jung often said that the task of a lifetime is the making of the self. He called this process individuation, and he believed it could never be achieved without facing the shadow. The shadow is not simply a burden to be carried, but the doorway to wholeness. Yet most people run from it all their lives. They hide behind masks, they project onto others, they build fragile towers of purity, and in doing so, they cut themselves off from their own depth. The most dangerous sign in a person, Jung believed, is when this running hardens into certainty. When someone insists that they are only good, that all evil belongs to others, that they themselves are above envy, anger, or greed, the danger has already begun. For such a person is no longer in contact with reality. They have split themselves into fragments, clinging only to what seems acceptable and throwing the rest into darkness. The more they deny, the more power those hidden forces gain. Jung warned that sooner or later, what is denied will return. The shadow waits patiently. It may return in sudden bursts of rage that shock even the one who lashes out. It may return in patterns of destruction, repeated mistakes that seem to come from nowhere. It may return in illness, in depression, in dreams that disturb sleep and refuse to be silenced. And if it is never faced, it can return on a collective scale, sweeping through entire groups of people who all share the same blindness, binding them together in fear, hatred, and violence. Yet Jung was not a pessimist. He did not believe the shadow was simply evil. He believed it was part of the soul's natural structure. Just as night belongs to day, so does shadow belong to light. He wrote that those who dare to meet their own darkness do not become worse, but better. They become deeper, more grounded, more human. They discover that what they feared in themselves was not only destructive impulse, but also passion, courage, creativity, and vitality. The same fire that burns can also give warmth. To stay alert, then, is not only to watch others, but to watch ourselves. The dangerous sign is not only out there, in the people we distrust, but within us whenever we deny what is ours to carry. Each time we say to ourselves, "I could never be cruel, I could never be selfish, I could never betray," we should pause. For in that certainty, the seed of danger is already planted. The shadow asks to be acknowledged, not to be denied. It asks us to look with clear eyes and say, "Yes, these things live in me, but I will not let them control me." Jung believed that this act of acknowledgement is the beginning of wisdom. A wise person is not one who is free of darkness, but one who knows where their darkness lies and refuses to let it rule unchecked. They do not need to project it onto others, because they have claimed it as part of themselves. They do not need to wear a rigid mask, because they are not afraid to admit that they are flawed. And because they are honest with themselves, they can be honest with others. He once wrote that no tree can grow to heaven unless its roots reach down to hell. This was not meant as despair, but as guidance. To grow into our highest self, we must also descend into what is lowest. To become whole, we must gather not only the light but also the shadow. The person who refuses this descent, who pretends their roots are pure and spotless, builds a life that cannot withstand the storms of reality. Their roots are shallow, and when the wind comes, they fall. This fall is the collapse of the mask, the eruption of the denied shadow, and it is often most destructive when it is least expected. The dangerous sign, then, is the absence of humility. It is the refusal to say, "I too am capable of what I despise." It is the insistence that the darkness belongs only to others. And it is this blindness that Jung saw again and again as the seed of tragedy, whether in personal lives torn apart by unacknowledged impulses, or in nations consumed by their own collective shadow. But there is another path. Jung's work was not only a warning, but also a call to courage. To live fully is to risk looking into the depths of one's own soul. It is to open the locked rooms of the house and see what has been hidden there. It is to admit envy, to confess anger, to recognize cruelty, and then to choose differently, not by denial but by awareness. This path does not erase danger, but it transforms it. The person who faces their shadow carries it consciously, and because they know its weight, they are less likely to throw it on others. In this sense, Jung saw individuation not only as a personal journey, but as an ethical responsibility. To know one's own darkness is to prevent it from spilling into the world unchecked. The one who admits their capacity for cruelty is less likely to act it out. The one who confesses their envy is less likely to sabotage others. The one who accepts their selfishness is more able to balance it with generosity. The shadow does not vanish, but it no longer rules in secret. So when Jung spoke of the most dangerous sign in a person, he was pointing to a blindness of the soul, a refusal to see what is already there. It is not the darkness itself that destroys, but the denial of it. And he believed that the work of every human being is to stay alert to that denial, in themselves as much as in others. For only by facing what is hidden can one walk the path toward wholeness, and only by walking that path can we hope to live with depth, humility, and true strength.